So just before starting, I just want to say, I think you're one of the most brilliant investors in the world, and I think that the fact that you let everyone see your plan of work is amazing. But I also think that no matter how the quantum thing goes, you'll be successful because the way you work...
Okay. Just stop. I just want to stop right there. Like, we're not here to talk about what my career is or isn't, or is going to look like or isn't. Like, I don't
want to take it personal.
I don't need to be patronized. I don't know who you are. I'm not going to go through your credentials. You know,
you can think that I'm an idiot. It's okay, but I'm just saying you're amazing.
Like, you're not. I appreciate the compliments, but I also don't want to hear what's going to happen to me or like. Do
you understand that you're different than other people?
Let's get to the point. You know, we're here to talk about.
But do you understand that when you enter a position that's totally different than anyone else?
We're here to talk about quantum.
Sure, but do you understand this?
Understand what? You're not explaining.
You are a great investor, and when you go into a position, even if you lose by a lot, you will recuperate, you will learn.
We're not here to talk about that. We're not here to talk about that.
But do you understand this?
It's not relevant. We're here to talk about.
It's relevant.
No,
because the way you think is different.
We're here to talk about
quantum. And the way you build your trades is different.
We're here to talk about quantum technology. That's it.
Okay.
So I guess you're a bull. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm a bear. And I guess maybe you can start by explaining why you're a bull, where you think this industry is going to go.
Okay, so there are levels to my bull thesis. You can look at the companies trying to do work right now. IonQ, Rigetti, QBTS. That's one level of application right now. And then there's the level of, is quantum computing even going to be successful, or quantum annealing? Is it going to be successful? That's another level. And I think another level above this is, how are scientific fields advancing right now? And I think that because of AI, every researcher, every scientist, every programmer has in his hands the strongest tool ever, pretty much, that's only getting better to test his ideas and his dreams. And some way or another, when you have such a powerful tool in the hands of people, you make all the hardest problem accessible to more and more people. Somewhere there's going to be a breakthrough. I don't think a breakthrough takes another 20 years or 25 years, because Nvidia already did a breakthrough, and you can't have a breakthrough unless you get all the other subsequent breakthroughs near. So I think that from the level of AI, there was a breakthrough. There's going to be a breakthrough in quantum computing and quantum annealing. And then we can argue, is D-Wave doing this, or is Rigetti doing that, or is IonQ doing that, or Quantinuum, or all the other companies. Specific companies, I don't really care. I just look at the fundamentals of where people work, where AI works. And that's my thesis. Okay?
Okay, there's just an echo, so I'm going to make sure that when you talk, you say your thing, and then when I talk, I say my thing, and we just go back and forth, because otherwise, if we talk at the same time, we're going to get an echo problem. So I'm not going to interrupt you.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. So I see what you're saying.
Okay,
you're doing it as we speak. Like, literally, we have to take turns, okay?
No, but why is someone telling me on chat about Jewish? That's insane right now. That shouldn't happen, okay?
Listen, I can't control what people write or don't write. I can on Godel. I can ban somebody on Godel if they're anti-Semitic. I can't do that on YouTube. We have mods. Any mods, feel free to do that. I can't moderate the YouTube while we talk. Let's go back to quantum. Okay, so AI is going to create some scientific breakthroughs. There are some questions about that. I am very bullish on AI. I mentioned my family connections to AI. So I'm also in that category. I spent a good chunk of the weekend working on this kind of thing, this exact kind of thing, trying to find curve isogenies in elliptic curve cryptography to attempt to make it faster. And I think Scott Aaronson just gave a talk at Harvard that said the next busy beaver proof, that's something he's really interested in is Busy Beaver, which is a mathematical thing. The next big Busy Beaver proof is going to be, as he said, from our friends in AI, quote unquote. So, I'm sort of on board that AI is good and AI is going to make, science go faster and things like that. There are a lot of questions about how much faster. Is every part of science going to be made faster? Is how fast for each different part, et cetera. Could there be some parts that are immune to AI, so to speak? What is the ceiling of AI? These are all pretty important questions. But the bigger question here is, what are we driving towards? What is the point for quantum? Where is quantum going? Why does, the AI breakthroughs, that whether it's the human mind that makes those breakthroughs for quantum, or it's the computer assisted human mind that makes those breakthroughs, or just the computer mind that makes those breakthroughs, I think the question is, where are we going? So Chris Monroe is one of the human minds, right? He made the first ion trap. He made the first logical qubit. He started IonQ, brilliant guy. He said quantum's a really long way away. But the question I have for you is, what gets you excited specifically about quantum? Not just what, that we're going to have breakthroughs, but what kind of breakthroughs, which will yield what kind of applications? And I'll go on mute now.
First of all, I think it's very smart of you to go to Chris Monroe and to main people in the industry and hearing their interviews. I'm not doing it enough because I'm mostly focused on papers and patents, but I watch what you do and it's amazing. I don't think that it's very hard to understand the size of influence these tools have. I don't know if there's any one person who can visualize everything that's going on. That's why I prefer look at the papers and see it's just insane amount of papers and ideas of researchers. I just think that you have I forgot its name, convergence of many sciences happening right now. I'm sure you know the problem of P versus NP because you also talk about Scott Anderson, and he's one of the leading expert in this. I think I got his name wrong, but he's one of the leading researchers in this. And the thing is that problems have patterns that return. So if you build a bridge between problems, if you see that one problem can be reduced to another problem, you actually get a bridge between different scientific realms. And so the different toolboxes can be shared between them. So when you talk about quantum, that's a step below this, because I'm just looking at how people are interacting right now. They can take ideas for chemistry, from biology, from physics. We still have the luxury of living in a world where we can, circle a place and say this is chemistry, circle another place and this is biology. I don't think that's going to last that long. I think that models they look at patterns and they see underlying structure and they don't care about other things. And so you're going to get more bridges between things. And I don't think people can understand these bridges right now. The more you get the bridges, the more advanced you're going to get. And I think that this advancements will also happen in quantum. So that's what I'm excited about. That's why I also told you about nuclear energy and about stuff. Now, why specifically? Now, why do I think the nuclear energy and quantum is different than weed or the genome or stuff like that? Because AI has a problem. Either it needs a lot of energy. So there are two options for it to evolve. One is to get the nuclear energy route. Okay, we need supply chains and stuff like that. We need to get these things going. Russia has the biggest provider of high-grade uranium. That's 10x. The largest mines are in Kazakhstan. So we're going to need supply chains for that. But companies might say, listen, with all the politics going, I don't want to be dependent on all these sites. Let's try and attack the computational model. Let's try new algorithms. And that's why I think they're like, okay, let's throw $100 million at quantum. Let's see what happens there. So actually AI needs quantum because nuclear is not always available for it. So that's why I look at the growth for quantum. AI needs it. It needs to be better, and it's going to do everything it can to be better. And I think it'll succeed.
Okay, so I'm going to respond to some of this. So the AI needs quantum. We have to talk about, because I very, very much disagree. I'm going to try not to make some kind of call to authority, but we can go into this in a little bit. But in terms of scientific overlaps and laterals, I mean, obviously, there's this idea of like the Langlands conjecture and other kinds of like, ideas that, of course, we see a lot of the same things in math and science come up over and over again. And that is something great and beautiful about, this world. To me, that as great as that is, in the investing world I have to live in, I live in a world of cash flows and revenue and things like that. And so what I have to do is work backwards. I've invested in science-based companies for my whole life. And, what my job is to study the science, not to the point where I can compete with 𝗕𝗏𝗘𝗓𝗓𝗏 intellectually, but to the point where I feel comfortable, where I understand it. And then my next goal is to sort of try to visualize the science translating into some kind of application. That application eventually has to translate into some kind of revenue, and the revenue has to translate into some kind of earnings. And by the time that happens, it's usually a long time, but the market can sniff out those early pieces of science that presage the early pieces of applications, that presage the early pieces of revenue that give rise to the profits at some point. So I think that, that is pretty normal for me to look at. And what I struggle with quantum, which I have not seen in some of the other fields I've been in, scientific fields. Weed is obviously not a scientific field, but it is a bubble. It was a bubble. This is in my opinion, a bubble in a scientific field. Just because there's science doesn't mean there's not a bubble. There are some things in science that are investable, some that are not. Technology is not always manifesting itself in a commercial opportunity, and it's not always manifesting itself in a stock. In this case, you sort of have a stock, and you have stocks, and they're sort of representative of those technologies. And I think that's what happened in genomics, where people got really excited about genomic technology. We can play with DNA in this really great way. So what stocks do I buy to take advantage of this? This is kind of like a natural way a lot of people think. It's very, I think, fallacious, but they do it anyway. And so they bought, the genomic stocks that really just didn't have anything to do with genomics, and half the time, and the other half the time just could not actually monetize or like commercialize genomics. So in any event, getting back to the point, I appreciate the overlaps as much as you do. I do think that there's, a lot of this, lateral or overlapping that happens among scientific fields, but I do still question kind of what AI is good for, and we'll talk about that in a second, but that's kind of what I want you to sort of focus on, and we'll talk about this in much more detail on the AI side. But I don't dispute that science often has these beautiful overlaps, and that we can't always foresee how they will overlap, and that things in quantum physics show up all over the place, and things in science show up in all kinds of disparate fields, including biology and other fields you might not naturally think of. So I do, want to ask the question to one end. Now, you did provide kind of an answer there, which is AI, which is, in investing, I mean, especially in publicly traded companies, there has to be an end, right? There's not too many publicly traded companies that I know that are just science projects. There ultimately has to be a business somewhere. It's great for MIT, it's great for, Harvard, but to a publicly traded company, revenue and sales are important. That's the end. So, that's sort of the question I would say for number two. For number three, AI needs quantum. So I couldn't disagree with this anymore. And again, I want to be careful not, appealing to authority, but I will say that the practitioners in the field don't agree with this. I think if you ask 10 out of 10, you ask 100 AI practitioners, which, I could do on my on my Twitter. I know a lot of AI people, CEOs of the biggest AI companies and employees of those very big AI companies, including Nvidia. There doesn't seem to be an agreement with this. Now, you could be right and they could be wrong, which is fine. And then there are people looking into quantum machine learning, one of whom is the kind of 𝗥𝗓𝗏 founder, 𝗩𝗓𝗘𝗧𝗍, who is the quantum TensorFlow head at Google. And he also agrees with me that we're not going anywhere here. But it's not important to make teams and say, okay, well, this guy agrees with me and that guy agrees with you and so forth. I think the ultimate thing that's important is why. Why do they agree and why do they not agree? And I think that the key that Jensen said in one interview, someone said, well, why, Jensen? Why is quantum not useful? He said, quantum's useful for combinatorial problems, and AI isn't really a combinatorial problem. It's a large amount of data problem. So the biggest problems with like the H100, A100, these are Nvidia's products, and the B100 is really a RAM problem. So like you actually do need to put the whole internet in these things to make tools. So you need bandwidth, and bandwidth is like, if you studied the Nvidia story, you know that their Mellanox acquisition, was very important to them. And putting all of this information through the training system is very, very hard to do. So you need huge amounts of bandwidth with VRAM specifically, and also across the nodes of a cluster. The nodes have to be connected, which is really painful because you can end up spending almost as much on the fabric, on the actual kind of like connective materials between these tools than you can on the machines themselves. That's a little exaggeration, but it is a really remarkable issue when you're trying to train over 1 million machines to keep those machines connected and so forth. Quantum, to me, and I could be wrong here, but to me, quantum is kind of the opposite, where it's like you have this one box and you can do this crazy like 10 to the 50th problem, but you have to set it up and you have to write a custom circuit. It's a single circuit that's like very specific. And that circuit, will run in a speed that, not even speed really, but more because they're very slow actually, but in a way that can actually solve a very difficult combinatorial problem. The AI problems right now, at least, are very, very different. I've got 100 exabytes of data, this is maybe a little exaggeration, but 100 exabytes of data, and you need to shove it into 100,000 H100s. This is, or 100,000 D100s. This is really hard because it's a lot of information. You can't really put information in quantum computer. It doesn't work that way. The bandwidth is too low. Most of these machines are somewhere between 100 hertz and maybe, a megahertz at best, or I guess I should say gigahertz at best. Somewhere very, very, very low. And so I think that like maybe a megahertz is right actually. You can't really run these machines very quickly, and the amount of data they can store is really limited. So at 165 qubits, there's actually no quantum memory at all. The most data you can fit in 165 qubits is no different than any other 165-bit system. So this is just what 20 bytes. It's not a lot. It's not a lot that's really not a lot of to fit in. You have to feed that data into each qubit individually. So you have very, very little ability to actually run the program and store data. But it is very good for a program you can describe in relatively small amounts, where you could say, well, this qubit represents this and this qubit represents that. And you can sort of do some of this math where, you have, let's say, these qubits, and you can sort of say that when this program's compiled, that these qubits represent, the solution to some complex question, and that in the right superposition, you will get the answer that is correct, that a normal computer could take a lot of time to answer. Now, as I've studied these things and written code in this space and talked to a lot of experts, my girl taught quantum complexity with Scott Aaronson at MIT. We tried really hard to figure this out. Really, the only thing that is applicable here, quantum being useful for AI, I think would be her, since she knows a little bit about quantum and she knows a lot of bit about AI, and she doesn't see a connection or any valuable, kind of part at all. Now, maybe she's not thinking broadly enough or creatively enough, and it's hard to think that creatively. Real genius comes from that creative thinking. But I would say that what quantum is really good for is a combinatorial problem like Shor's. What is the, solving a biprime or some other discrete log problem, solving, something like traveling salesman problem, or 3-SAT, or like any of these like very difficult combinatorial problems that are easy to put on paper, but really hard to solve, but not something that has a lot of data. AI is a lot of data. And Jensen said this many times, that these are really fundamentally different problems where AI is trying to take the petabytes of the internet, put them in an LLM, that's kind of the best thing we know of so far, and adjust. And I think that, whether it's diffusion models, which are kind of the second best, model, you're also still trying to take diffusion examples, training data, whether it's, what doesn't matter what the model is, and you're trying to update weights. And the weights are enormous size, right? Like a lot of them don't even fit across, one machine. So by updating the weights, you need high throughput. So you need a machine that can prepare the quantum circuit, read through it, get the result out, and then update the weights. And we have a tool for this. It's the Nvidia tool. And in fact, it's not too hard to use. It works really fast. So I don't personally see what quantum can add to AI. I can see what it can add to Shor's, which is, I think a problem that is very limited in scope and importance. And then I can kind of see, some utility here, which is more like the final, like the next frontier for quantum is, whether it's quantum variational eigensolvers or other types of like quantum algorithms. These are the next level for quantum. But Shor's was the first thing that inspired quantum, and is probably the nearest term like actual thing that could be interesting, I think. But AI feels like it, for the reasons I've given, doesn't feel like AI and quantum even touch at all. So that's my 2 cents. I'm curious what you have to say.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the notes, because I can use your notes now. Can you scroll up? Regarding the lateral overlaps, your star in pharma, I want to ask you a question about medicine. Would you agree that one of the greatest advancements in medicine in the 20th century was the use of MRI?
Sure.
And because you've also covered it, MRI didn't come from doctors. It came from a physics discovery.
Right.
A huge advancement in medicine came from something that, doctors couldn't even think of. I'm sure the physicists didn't also think about it. And the fact is that the nature of reality is much more connected than we think. So you can have the smartest people in AI thinking, quantum is not related to AI, and that's fine. But they're seeing it from their perspective, and the tools they're using, well, I think they're just going beyond what their creators or these smart people are thinking. They don't care about these boundaries. They look at a problem and they analyze the patterns, and then they try and see, can I advance it further? What kind of tools can I use? They don't have any bias if it's from physics or from chemistry or whatnot. They don't care. So the same way that medicine got a breakthrough from physics, where both the medical people and the physicists didn't know anything about each other, I think that these breakthroughs can now happen even without people from the two fields knowing it happened, because the patterns converged inside the AI models, and that's very important. Now, regarding your third point, you beautifully illustrated where quantum can help right now with combinatorial problems, and that's correct. But the question is now, can we reduce some of the problems? You also said there's a problem with memory. That's also correct. The question is, can we reduce some of the calculations to a combinatorial problem so that we can maybe leverage what we have in the quantum component? And I think this connects to what Jensen was talking about when he said that a CPU and a GPU and a QPU will live together side by side. I can't say right now that you can't have any reduction that will be able will help AI leverage this combinatorial power to become better. I actually think that if you actually found something that you are much better than classical computation in, the question now remains, can I find a reduction to go into that field and do the calculation and go back? That's a very hard question, and I think AI will probably be the best at answering it. I'm just saying it's not very clear to me right now that you can even imagine this connection, because the scientific work is moving from experts who are human to connectors which are in models. And the question is about reduction right now. I would trust Jensen if he said that he thinks there's a room for the three of them, but even he doesn't know. I mean, why are they giving this out to everyone in the world pretty much? I think they understand that there's a limit to what they can understand about their invention, and they have their own biases. And then they're like, let's see what happens. Like, there's another claim that people talk about. Why do you think that a company like Rigetti or D-Wave or IonQ, why do you think they will beat quantum and not Google or Microsoft? That's a good question. But if you look at AI, the company that brought it forward wasn't Google, even though they had most GPUs. Okay, it wasn't Microsoft. It was actually OpenAI. It's funny how the disruptors, they usually don't come from the big companies. So all I'm saying is that you also said something about revenue streams and cash flows and stuff like that. It's also very important. I think the business is also having a revolution right now, because I don't know if even quarters are enough to assess the worth of a company where the advancement is so fast. I'm sure people will adapt and succeed in doing it, but there's a lot of changes happening right now. And all I'm saying is, my quantum bullishness is about, can we positively say there's no reduction that can help speed computing with the through the quantum components? I can't say that. I don't think that anyone can say that. I think that AI models will be able to do something eventually. When I imagine AI models, I look at them as like big dragons, and everyone is trying to ride those dragons. And I think that scientific work is about who can ride these things and try to understand, try to build something and bring it back. But nothing is staying the same.
Cool. Yeah. So, okay. So I think I understand and agree with that. You know, it is hard to predict where science will go. It's part of an investor's job, though. And it's hard to predict how big things will be. But what's interesting is you can kind of, I think, do this for the reasonable near term. So for example, you know, I can say, well, what does one of these companies have going on for, make my little financial model for 2026? All right, well, you know, the technology isn't very useful. Why? Because the qubit fidelity isn't very good. So what will revenue be? Revenue will be from, you know, governments, people experimenting, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be much, say 5 million. And then I can say, well, what's 27 going to look like? Well, the qubits will be better in that year, but I don't think it's going to change the demand. Well, let's see what happens. Now, I keep thinking, well, what's going to happen in 2028? Well, maybe the qubits get better and better. But what are we going to use them for? What are the first customers going to care about? And as an investor, my job isn't to worry about, will somebody invent MRI 50 years from now? My job is to figure out, when will the first dollars start to come in from this? And try to keep my ear to the ground and say, okay, I can hear the elephants coming, or I can't. And there's no elephants coming. And so for now, having studied this field exhaustively, the best I can say is that at some point in the future, I don't know when, it could be in 2028, it could be in 2048, but at some point in the future, somebody's going to be interested in quantum for at least one application, which is Shor's. And Shor's I can put, I can put my finger on. And I worked with OpenAI's ChatGPT very extensively to speed up this elliptic curve cryptography, which could be used to, quantum could be used for. And I begged ChatGPT to look at my work and take it seriously. And it just said, you know what? It's all really well-intended work. It's hard work, which I hope to publish or at least put on GitHub. But you're better off waiting for a quantum computer, Martin. I sort of said, I would like to see if traditional computing can't get us to a Shor-like, place at some point. And they said, unless you make a huge discovery, you have to wait for quantum before you can solve these problems. And I said, fine. And, of course, GPT thinks quantum's going to take a long time, just like everybody else. But my question is and I want to touch on the small versus big stuff in a second, but as an investor, sometimes you can think that the technology is going to change the world. 3D printing was a good example. People said, well, 3D printing is really important. Imagine manufacturing, all of manufacturing turned on its head, where anybody can make anything they want just by uploading some instructions. 3D printing hasn't changed the world. It certainly didn't change the stock market. All the 3D printing stocks dropped a lot. And the cycle of hype gave into a cycle of reality, which gave into a sort of depression because there was this realization that maybe this technology isn't that great. Maybe, we overestimated the capabilities of this technology. And the same thing happened to CRISPR. CRISPR, you read about it and you say, wow, you can literally change, DNA. What an incredible invention. And then you read some more into it and you say, well, actually, you can only change DNA of liver cells. And, we have tons of technologies that are just as good, where you don't even need to change DNA. You could just silence the RNA, you can block the receptor, there's really not a need for it. And now you can't find one CRISPR stock that's worked and succeeded. And the question becomes, maybe CRISPR can edit other cells in 5 years or 10 years. They'll figure out a way, right? Well, they might, or they might not. We don't know. Antibodies are another example where antibodies could never get inside of cells. And people would have said, well, at some point, they'll get a way to put antibodies in cells. Well, it's been 50 years. And there's no way to put an antibody in a cell yet. So sometimes you can't just say, well, things will accelerate and then, there'll be some kind of invention or some kind of discovery that will bring us the business nirvana, because business doesn't, I think, work that way. In business, we have to sort of see a date, a time, and we have to discount cash flows. Because if you tell me, well, there'll be an intrabody, someday, well, I could have been sitting there holding for 50 years before I found the intrabody. So in technology investing, you have to be realistic about when something's going to happen. Because if the next quantum computing application happens in 2068, you can't really, in good faith, say, I told you so, Martin. I think I would raise my hand and say I was right, that it was going to take forever and nothing happened. So you can't, necessarily pick when those laterals and overlaps will happen. MRI and NMR are really good examples of physics turning into real world, work and real world applications. MRI industry isn't very big, and NMR industry isn't very big either. So this comes to valuation, where we have to actually think about what are we paying for and why are we paying it? And that's what investing is. That's what I'm really, really good at. And I look at these values and say, if I can have D-Wave for free, maybe I'd buy it. Or IonQ, maybe. But you still have capital that has to be invested. And that capital has to have a positive return. And it's hard to know if it will have a positive return. You may not get back a return of your capital, let alone a return on your capital. So the speculation is awesome. It's what makes science interesting. But for business, oftentimes I think investors want to know what's the application. And so for parallel computing, Jensen had a really good application, video games. And it created a $10 billion company. It was fantastic. And of course, you know, it turns out that parallel computing can also power AI. That's wonderful for Jensen and terrible for Intel. So you know, we could have bought Intel and said, well, Intel is a master of computing, and who knows what'll happen in the future of computing. Maybe they'll be able to do parallel computing. Well, Nvidia did parallel computing. Intel's sitting there laying off people, the stock has been a dog, etc. Superconducting is another field that's gone nowhere. You could have bought superconducting stocks 40 years ago. They've just been a crummy field waiting for success. So I think it does matter what the scientific field is, what specifically is exciting, because there are a wide array of scientific exciting adventures that you can go on. CRISPR is a good one. Imagine every disease solved with CRISPR someday. Why don't we load the boat of CRISPR stocks? Well, you can buy CRISPR stocks trading at cash value, let alone multi-billion values. You know, the market's paying $10 billion for IonQ. There's no technology there that's worth anything. But the market's paying for it because we're in a bit of a hype cycle. CRISPR at one point was the same exact thing. CRISPR stocks were trading for billions, and now you can basically get them for free because people got disenchanted with the technology. They lost interest, they lost excitement, because the actual reality didn't match the hype. And that cycle can go on for decades, decades. So I think that when you invest, you want to compound your capital, right? You want to make 10% a year or 20% a year. And people do that different ways. Some people do that by investing really early, 20, 30 years in advance, and just waiting for the 100x. Even if it takes 20 years, 100x makes you a great return over the long run. And if you can't see 20 years in the future, well, that's your problem, because if somebody can, and they know for sure that in 20 years there's going to be a major, major breakthrough and a major application that's going to be a big market, then it's worth waiting the 20 years. Now, of course, the problem is you don't know what's going to happen over 20 years with Silicon Valley. Is there going to be financing available? Is this the right management team? Will there be a new company that comes in? So there's always risk. You know, just because if a technology is hot doesn't mean that, you know, as I said the other day, there's about 30 serious quantum companies with serious capital. There's 4 that are publicly traded. The rest are private or part of big companies. So why are these 4 special? They're not. In fact, odds are in 10 or 20 years, most of them won't exist. And it would be Facebook that wins the internet instead of Yahoo. And as an investor, my job is to avoid crazy risks and even short crazy risks. And the crazy risk is that these 4 companies, 2 of which are not even really quantum, there'll actually be some discovery, and there'll actually be an application that will actually result in revenue that is actually worth the bet. Not that there'll ever be an application. I'm sure there'll be an application for quantum someday. I'm sure. The question is, what stock do I bet on now, and why, at what price? And I don't think you can say, well, the application is going to be so big that it'll just be worth any price, because that's, if you look at MRIs, again, there's a handful of companies that deal in MRIs. It's a multi-billion-dollar market, but it ain't AI. It ain't GPUs. It ain't CRISPR. It ain't some massive industry. It's maybe a $50 billion industry. And right now, quantum in total is worth more than 50 billion. So if you think about the market cap you're paying now for potentially something possibly working in the future, it has to be worth 100 billion or 200 or 500 or a trillion. But we can't even think about what that looks like. And I don't think it's easy to just say, well, superposition is a really powerful thing. Sure it is. So is gravity. You know, why aren't we betting on gravity? You know, it's not obvious why or what, you know, we're going to get out of this. And as a guy that, you know, I'm running H100s right now, running very compute sensitive calculations, I would love a quantum computer. And I've tried all the ones that are available. They don't do anything yet. And I'm going to try them next year. And I'm going to try them the year after. And I'm going to be the first guy to try every new quantum computer. But the problem is, I'll start thinking about buying these stocks when I have a vivid imagination, when I can imagine an actual use. Then and only then am I going to get interested in these kinds of like very amorphous, like, you know, science shows up everywhere, it all overlaps, it's going to, you know, be valuable someday. I need to know what it is. I can't just sort of buy these stocks at a valuation that's very high. It'd be one thing if they were brand new startups trading at 10 million Series A, 20 million, but at multi-billion-dollar values, I've never seen in my investing career something that makes sense like that. I've invested in novel science, but it's typically at a very low valuation because the risk is so high. It's about as speculative as it gets. So I need to get a huge reward to take on that kind of speculative scientific risk. Here, I'm getting the opposite. I'm taking on this huge risk at a 5 billion valuation for one of these, at a $10 billion valuation for another, but nobody's told me what the upside is and when it's coming. And I have to guess. And the guess is probably going to be similar to CRISPR, similar to 3D printing. There's going to be snags, there's going to be problems. And do I have to wait 20 years? Do I have to wait 50 years? Do I have to wait 80 years? There's no telling. You know, will those be pulled in by AI? Sure, but if it gets pulled in 60 years to 40 years, I'm not sure it helps me very much. So that's kind of how I think of these things as an investor. And I think we should pivot our discussion to that because the science side is lovely, and we're not even touching on the deep details of the science, but it's it's not tangible enough. We can't sit and say as investors, oh, just hope that at some point some good thing is going to happen. And be price independent. Don't worry if it's a 10 billion. Don't worry if it's 1 billion. Would I buy these stocks if it was 100 billion value? Of course not. Would I buy them for $1 trillion value? You'd have to be out of your mind. Would I buy them for $1 billion? I did my first quantum computing video when these stocks were trading at 100 million and $1 billion. I said, they're not bad. You know, maybe something will come of this thing. So, I'm price dependent, as all investors should be. There's a price where none of this makes sense. There's a price where you sell Nvidia. If somebody said Nvidia's trading at 100 trillion, I'd say, I don't care how good it is. If it's trading at 100 trillion, it better be making like 2 trillion in earnings or something. And, that's not where we're at. So to me, the price matters a lot. Anyway, that's kind of my thought on this.